So, without further ado, this is actually part two of our first Miami archaeology discipleship class, which is going to be talking today about the origins of biblical Israel. And this is something that's been a really keen topic for actually over 100 years in biblical archaeology. And as it turns out, the whole scholarly discussion has moved actually away from the Bible and its version of things with the founding of the state of the nation of Israel. But we'll go back into the details about it as we go on here. So, as it turns out, a lot of this actually originates or emanates from Egypt, ancient Egypt. And some of this stuff I only came upon in the last couple of years, and I think it's really underappreciated by even a lot of biblical scholars as to how early we have evidence of the Israelites in inscriptions. So whenever you have inscriptions, it's a very special kind of artifact because most artifacts are just they're mute, as it were. So when you have an inscription, it gives you a lot of great information, names, languages, events, dates, and things like that. So it's really great when you find inscriptions. So as we move on, one of my little slides here is I believe in yesterday. I love this saying because it kind of captures what our faith is. It's an historic faith, and it's one that's rooted in history. And if that history isn't true, then, as Paul would say, our faith is in vain, and we're fools. So I don't happen to believe that we're fools, and I don't think that our faith is in vain. And I know that we have a lot of historical information and corroboration to base our faith on, and that's unlike any other, outside of perhaps Judaism, any other faith in the world. So it's very important, I think, to our faith to have this historical root and connection. So when we talk about the origins of Israel, if you start back in the book of Genesis, we don't have a whole lot to go on. So you really don't start to find archaeological evidence of things in the Bible until probably the book of Joshua. So you have there are 400 years that the Israelites spent in Egypt, of course, but up until now we don't have really any evidence of the Israelites being in Egypt at all. Now, it doesn't mean that they weren't or that it didn't happen. As one person said, absence of evidence doesn't equal evidence of absence. So just because we don't have the evidence of it doesn't mean it didn't happen and it didn't occur. One day we may find evidence for the Israelites in Egypt. Now, we do have evidence of Semites or Canaanite type people who were like the Israelites in Egypt, working as slaves on building projects, just like we have described in the accounts of Exodus and stuff, where they're building buildings for the Egyptians as slaves. So there's evidence of that in ancient Egypt, but not specifically Israelites. So where do we start to pick up ancient Israel? Well, you have the 400 years in Egypt, and then you have the 40 years wandering in the desert. We don't have evidence of that. But once they come into the land, then they're promised the land of milk and honey, the promised land, and they are to take it by force, by conquest. And so then they're to be given this land because the Canaanite peoples and the other peoples that were living there had defiled the land, and the land belonging to God was his to give and to take away. So when they had defiled themselves and become unholy and falling into sin, he ejected them from the land, but then Israel was to come and take possession of it. But they were to do it by force and to be faithful to God's command to do that. So we'd call this event under Joshua the conquest. I think that's a misnomer, and I'm going to get to tell you why here soon. So how do we date the conquest? So there are several key verses. 1 Kings 6, 1 is one of the main verses. It says, in the 480th year after Israel came out of Egypt, in the fourth year of Solomon's reign, he began to build the house of the Lord, the temple. Now we can date his Solomon's reign based upon synchronisms with Assyrian or Mesopotamian dating, which was based upon astronomical observations, which they were making even back then. So we can actually, about the time of the United Monarchy, David and Solomon, we can start to date things almost exactly by the year based upon these synchronous events that tie Assyria to ancient Israel. So that's a key verse. Another one is Solomon reigned. Okay, so these are the years that he actually reigned, from 970 to 931 BC. So his fourth year would have been 967 BC. Now, if you add 480 years to 967, you come up with 1447. So that's when they crossed the Jordan, and then after the 40 years in the desert. So about 1407 BC is what we're talking about, coming in and conquering Jericho first. And then there's another verse in Judges chapter 11, which says, while Israel lived in Heshbon and Aroer and all the cities on the banks of the Arnon, 300 years. So this passage we date roughly to about 1100 BC. So if you add another, sorry, let me get rid of the pictures that are blocking my slides. There. So that also correlates to about 1400 BC when they came across the Jordan. Okay, so then we have a New Testament verse in Acts chapter 13 where Paul is speaking and he stands up and he motions with his hand, says, men of Israel and you who fear God, listen. The God of this people, Israel, chose our fathers and made the people great during their stay in the land of Egypt. And with an uplifted arm, he led them out from it. For a period of about 40 years, he put up with them in the wilderness. When he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he distributed their land as an inheritance, all of which took about 450 years. After these things, he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet. So again, we have the same dating given in a different way. So we have several theories about how Israel came into being, ancient Israel. The traditional conquest model is that they came in just like the book of Joshua says, and they conquered all these cities and then they inhabited them. But we know that they didn't actually conquer all those cities. In fact, many of them they didn't conquer, and then they continued to fight amongst the Canaanites and then amongst themselves as well for centuries after that time, going through the book of Judges. So that's the traditional conquest model. That's a straightforward reading from the Bible, Joshua and Judges. Then they started coming up with other theories because they couldn't find evidence for some of the destructions amongst the cities that were listed as having been conquered by Joshua. So another theory they came up with was the peaceful infiltration theory. So this says that they came from the outside, but they peacefully immigrated in, and there was no conquest, there was no fighting or anything like that. So that helps to explain the lack of evidence for these destructions of cities that we can identify that are named in Joshua, the peaceful infiltration theory. Now, another one they called is this peasant revolt theory, which one of the scholars that I know just died. He called it the revolting peasant theory because he didn't like it. And this is actually based upon a Marxist model of societal development. And it says that the workers within Canaan rebelled and then they against their overlords in Canaan, and they simply became Israel by way of unifying politically and then overthrowing their overlords like the bourgeois and the proletariat. But that doesn't really count for, I mean, ancient societies didn't operate like modern industrial societies. So, you really can't apply modern things like that to an ancient society like ancient Israel was. But this also helps to explain that there's not a big difference between the Israelites when they do show up, their material culture, and the Canaanite culture. They look very, very similar. You might even think they were the same people. So that would explain that part of it. And then what the last one here is probably the most popular one today. And that is that the Israelites were they were just Canaanites all along, but then they started to coalesce around a God named Yahweh, and then they became Israelites. But you see, now we've moved farther and farther from the biblical account to where they're not even coming in from Egypt anymore, wandering in the desert. They were just Canaanites all along, and they were there all along, and they just kind of developed their own ethnic identity. So this completely throws out the biblical account, but that's also accounts for the similarity in material culture that I've mentioned a couple of times now between the Canaanites and the Israelites. So, unfortunately, that's where we are today. The emergence theory seems to be the most preeminent one outside of biblical circles or biblical, I would say, sort of more like maybe evangelical or Catholic scholars. Okay, so I said that the conquest was sort of a misnomer, and that is because they never really came in and totally conquered the land. And the Bible says that. And so the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Hittites and all these other named peoples, they were still there. They were still living in the cities, and Israel wasn't faithful to drive them out. And the words used against these cities in the book of Joshua are not words that you would expect to find a destruction of the city, which sometimes you do if it's been totally burned and destroyed. But the words used in Joshua are different. There are these words right here, like to fight, lachem, to wound or smite is nakah, to rush upon or capture, lachad, or to besiege, hana. So these words are used, and you wouldn't necessarily expect to find a big destruction level of debris and burnt stuff that you do find when you do find destructions. So I think the conquest is a misnomer. It's more like an incursion, I would say, rather than a conquest. and it was incomplete, of course. And it even says here in Joshua chapter 11, however, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounts except for Hatzor alone, which Joshua burned. And also mentions Ai and Jericho. Now, Jericho had already happened by this time. So now they're saying after Jericho and Ai, this is the sequence of events. Now it says Israel didn't burn any of the cities except for Hatzor. Turns out at Hatzor, we do have a burn destruction level, which we can link to Joshua, based upon a late 15th century destruction, based upon the pottery evidence and other things. Okay, so the so-called promised land, I touched upon this earlier, but I'll reiterate. This is the promise of God to the Israelites to give them this land of milk and honey. Then it shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you great and splendid cities which you did not build, and houses full of all good things which you did not fill, and hewn cisterns which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant. So all these great things, if you follow my commands and you commit what is essentially kind of like genocide, which is a very, troubling concept, then all these things will be yours. That's the promise in the Bible. It's sort of an ethical dilemma, I think, for some believers to think that God would command a genocide like this against a Canaanite people. But that's the way I read it, and that's where most people understand it. So now we look at the first evidence we have of Israel, and it comes out of Egypt. These various lists called topographical lists, they list peoples and places that Egypt either conquered or controlled. And they would put all these names on columns and walls of their temples to show just how powerful Pharaoh was, and all of his realm, and all these named places and peoples that were under his control. And because he was like a human representation of the god of Amun. So he was obviously a king. And this was an example and demonstration of his power and his sovereignty, that they would have all these names and places on their temples. And this is a great geographical record as well. So the first one we're going to talk about is a temple called Soleb. It's a temple of Amun-Re. And this is just a mini picture of it. So this is just an overview. Amara West Temple, also in Egypt. The Merneptah Stela, and the Berlin statue pedestal. So those four things, and then one other thing I think we're going to talk about after that. So the first two temples we're talking about are actually located in modern, ancient Nubia, modern Sudan. So it's south of the Egyptian-Nubian border, but it's on the Nile River, which during various times when Egypt was more powerful, their control would extend south, farther down into Nubia. When they were weaker, they would pull back more, and Nubia would be stronger. So along this river, you have, wrong switch. There's a blow up. Now you see there's the border, the modern border. So it's well south of the Egyptian border, and the arrow is pointing to that site on the western shore of the Nile called Soleb. So this is how it was found back when they first came upon it, European explorers, and a nice little artist rendition of it. You see beautiful columns still standing after thousands and thousands of years. And they did a couple of decades of excavations here. It was described by one of the first observers, lost in the depths of distant Nubia, the Soleb Temple. So we're talking about a period of time when Amenhotep III, one of the great pharaohs of the New Kingdom, was in control of Egypt, and he was a great builder. So this lists a number of his building projects all up and down the Nile, from up to Memphis, down in Thebes, which was more or less the capital city during most periods of time, all the way down to Soleb. So a great pharaoh, a conquering pharaoh, and a building pharaoh. So there were several Amenhoteps. This was the third. And here's an aerial view back in 1963 of the temple after they had started excavating it, clearing it. And this dates to about 1360 BC. So you're talking about, in biblical terms, after Israel had entered the land, but they were still living in the tribal allotments at this point. So they were still a kind of semi-nomadic people. They hadn't settled into city-state or nation-state arrangement yet. So this is the time period we're talking about biblically under Amenhotep III. Here's a modern picture of someone that's visiting the temple. This is an overall ground plan of the temple, and this is was initially entered from the Nile. There was a key here, so it was a water entrance into the forecourt, the Nile Key, and then there were these huge date palm columns, 4 of them in that first section. And then this thing they call a pylon, which is a huge wall that is really the barrier to enter into the holy space of the temple. They call them pylons. And then you have two courtyards here, papyrus bundle columns. You'll see pictures of them in a minute. And then a hypostyle hall, which is just full of columns. And then sanctuary rooms in the, as what we might say, the Holy of Holies, like in this the Solomonic temple arrangement. So the farther you go into a temple like this, the more holy is the space, the more sacred. Now, these are pictures, or actually artists' drawings of these beautiful columns that are fashioned to look like date palm columns on the right and papyrus bundle columns on the left. And you see them there, pictures of them. Massive columns. Now, this is known as the Prudo Lions. There were two of them. They were excavated from a different site, but they originally came from Soleb, and they were in the temple, probably in that first entry where the Nile key comes in, but nobody knows for sure. And there isn't a lot of sculpture like this in ancient Egypt. They have different things like sphinxes, but not lions like this. So these are very unique. And this is to represent Amenhotep III as the so-called vanquisher of foreign lands. And here is one of them in the British Museum today. Now we're looking now at one of the columns that have the names of subject peoples and places. And these are all sort of stamped out like cookie cutters with a sort of formulaic person here, like a captive. So you have a person here with, you see his head and his body, and then his arms are bound behind him. And then below this, you have a name ring or a cartouche. And this is where all the different names of the nations and the peoples are given on these columns. So in the case of the one I'm going to show you, it's located right here, right in that corner. It's column number 4 in the hypostyle hall. And that's the actual cartouche. And now you'll see now that this is the lower half of it, because remember, the person is standing over top of it. So this was either broken or it came apart in antiquity, but originally it had that person standing over top. So what this says in the Egyptian is land of the Shasu of Yahweh. So we have the first occurrence of the name of Israelites' God in history in about 1360 BC on an Egyptian temple. And it's called land of the Shasu of Yahweh. Now, who are the Shasu? They were like a nomadic peoples, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but unsettled, not nation state people, but more like Bedouin. More closer look at the column when it was still intact here or put back together. You have the bound person on top with a cartouche below it, and how it's spelled out phonetically in the Egyptian. Now, I don't read Egyptian. I just have to believe what they tell me about it. So now this is what they call the Tetragrammaton, and this is the name of Israelites' God, Yahweh, or Yahweh, or Jehovah, some people call it, even though that's not really the proper pronunciation. To the most Orthodox Jews, they wouldn't even pronounce the name at all. So they were actually say Adonai when they hit this word. We were taught to read it that way when we were learning Hebrew in university. But I just want to show you the 4 letters, Yod He Vav He. Now this is reading left to right as English would read, but actually it reads right to left in the Hebrew below. Yod He Vav He, meaning the Lord. So this scholars who understand Egyptian and know about this inscription agree that this is the God of the Israelites mentioned in this inscription, and it gets very little attention, surprisingly. Now, this is a little bit of Egyptian history. So Egypt, as it became more and more powerful, started to move northward and other directions into Canaan and take over parts of these areas as provinces almost. So you have a stage 1, a stage 2, and a stage 3. So what we're talking about here, Amenhotep III, 1390, 1353. There's another archive of letters that come at the end of his reign, and he's addressed in some of these letters that are coming from Canaan, from kings and princes that are in Canaan, and they're under Egyptian control, but they're having troubles fighting amongst one another, and other people that are coming in making trouble, and they're appealing to the Pharaoh for help, to send troops here, send troops there, help me with this, such and such a king's making trouble, and you need to send some of your troops over here. So this is called the Elamarna letters, a wonderful document from the latter part of the 1300s. And a lot of cities that we know from the Old Testament are mentioned in these letters, but no particular people that we have that are mentioned in the Bible. So this is just a map showing Egypt moving farther and farther north with their control over time. Now, we go back to Nubia, to the second temple called Amara West. Now, this is another temple that was made by a different king, Ramses II, one of the longest reigning pharaohs in history. He ruled for over 60 years, and he was in his 90s when he finally died. But this was during the 1200s, and this temple is dated to about 1275. So it's roughly 100 years or so later than the Soleb temple. And it also has the mention, okay, some of the architecture, peristyle hall, hypostyle hall, some pictures. These are the best pictures I could find. They're very hard to find pictures of this temple. They're old black and whites, but it shows you, you can see all the writing and carving that are on these temples and columns. They're just full of names and places, just a wonderful historical document. And here it shows some of what we're concerned with today. Another mention of the land of the Shasu of Yahweh from the Temple of Ramses II. Now, it's generally thought that this is a copied list, topographical list from the earlier temple and Soleb. So it's not really a new document, but it's just a repetition of an old one. And this was common amongst pharaohs. They would always try to steal the glory of their forerunners. They would rub over the names in some of these great temples and stuff and put their own names over them. And so they were constantly, they call it usurping. So they would usurp their temples and their monuments. That was just a common way of doing business if you were a pharaoh. So this was an example of the same list probably just being repeated at Amara West. Now, it contains 6 different names that say land of the Shasu of whoever. 4 of the names on these 2 lists are common, 95 through 98 here. And then 197 is Yahweh, is also in common as well. Now, these Shasu toponyms are names that do appear in the Bible, like Seir, which is equated with Edom. 94, Rabban or Laban is found in Genesis chapter 24, brother of Rebekah. Samat, a clan of the Kenites in First Chronicles. So these are all names that we find in the Bible. So there's connections here. Tarabar or Warbar is a variant of the Wadi al-Hassa, which is a ravine or a riverbed. Geographical term. So we get to the term Shasu. Now, who are these Shasu people? I mentioned they were like Bedouin people, nomadic folks that were running around with their flocks, from area to area and never really settling in one place. Now, the Egyptian name for desert dwellers is equivalent to Bedouin, as I mentioned before. This is just a cartouche of Shasu. So the term itself derives from the verb which means to go or to pass through, which kind of makes sense. It's believed that the Canaanite word shasa can be traced to shasu and means to thieve or to plunder. So we get an idea of people that are roaming about and sometimes making a little trouble and taking things that aren't theirs. Probably not surprising. And it's possible that this is a word that was Semitic originally and it came into the Egyptian language. So these combine to describe a nomadic or a semi-nomadic group of herdsmen, organized probably along tribal lines. And sometimes they go on, marauding and plundering around the countryside if they were in need. So we have reliefs and depictions of these Shasu people in the Egyptian temples. So they're first mentioned during the reign of Thutmose II in the execration texts, which go all the way back to 1800 BC. So this is when they're first mentioned, these Shasu people, all the way down through Ramses III, which is around, say, 1150. So we got 700 years of time where Shasu are roaming about the frontiers of Egypt and mentioned in Egyptian documents. There's several mentions of Shasu in Nubia. Remember, that's the south of Egypt, but most of them are located to the north, as far north as Syria, but also in Lebanon, Canaan, Transjordan, modern Jordan, the Sinai, and the Nile Delta. So they tend to be to the north of Egypt. So they're often in conflict with Egyptian military forces. They're not a serious military threat. They're more like just a hindrance or a nuisance to the Egyptian forces. They're looked upon as, like I said, non-settled populations and outside of the borders of Egypt. So it's quite possible that Shasu people would be people that in the Bible would be called Edomites, Amalekites, Midianites, Moabites, Amorites, Apiru, that's a term from the Amarna archives, and Israelites. So Egyptians might have called the Israelites, oh, those are Shasu over here, maybe Shasu of Yahweh, or maybe just Shasu. So all these people in the Bible could have been considered Shasu by the Egyptians. So they weren't a true threat to Egypt's power, but just more like a nuisance. And occasionally they approach the frontiers of Egypt in need of water during times of drought. We see this in the Bible when the flocks during in Genesis, where the Israelites come up looking for water with Jacob and such. So this is also attested in Egyptian records. In Papyrus Anastasia VI, which is around 1200 BC, it says, another communication to my Lord. We have finished with allowing the Shasu tribes of Edom, it actually mentions Edomites, past the fortress of Merneptah, which is in Cheku, to the pools of Peratum, to keep them alive and to keep alive their livestock by the will of Pharaoh, the good son of Egypt. Now, these two terms, Cheku is Suko, which is in the Bible, and Peratum is Pitom, which is also mentioned as one of the storage cities that the Israelites helped to build. Yeah, Edom is mentioned throughout. Yeah, quite a bit. Now, it's not surprising that Pharaoh and his people had a disdain or contempt for these Shasu people. And it's even mentioned in the book of Genesis here in chapter 46. It says, and Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and speak to Pharaoh and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who are living in the land of Canaan have come to me. The men are shepherds, they tend livestock, and they have brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. When Pharaoh calls you in and asks, what is your occupation? You should answer, your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did. Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. So they definitely look down their noses at them. And we have this passage about Edom from Numbers chapter 20. Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. So now Moses has led his people out of Egypt, and they're trying to find the promised land, but they're wandering around and they want to go through this area of Edom. So Moses says, this is what your brother Israel says. You know about all the hardships that have come on us. Our ancestors went down to Egypt and we lived there for many years. Now we are here at Kadesh, a town on the edge of your territory. Please let us pass through your country. We will not go through any field or vineyard or drink water from any well. We will travel along the king's highway and not turn to the right or to the left until we have passed through your territory. So we're not going to bother you. Just let us go through and we'll be on our way. But of course, the Edomites didn't like that. They didn't want to let him come, and you have conflict. So Papyrus Anastasia I says, lions are more abundant than leopards and bears. So it's telling about this Shasu land in general, which was sort of a wild west with wild people and wild animals, more abundant than leopards and bears, while it is hemmed in on all sides by Shasu Bedouin. He has joined up with those who are wicked. He consorts with Shasu Bedouin. The narrow pass is dangerous, having Shasu Bedouin concealed beneath the bushes. They have fierce faces. They are unfriendly. Now we have a great battle relief of Seti I, one of the great pharaohs, in Karnak, which is in Thebes, one of the great temples there, showing the pharaoh battling Shasu. Now, typically you have Pharaoh supersized. He looks like a giant here, and his horse, chariot, running over and then, thumping all of these enemy peoples, and, the vanquished are laying on the ground before him. And so Pharaoh is never defeated. He's like, God's represented on earth. So all of his reliefs that show battles are a form of propaganda to make Pharaoh look great. Here's a nice line drawing where you can really see all the details. You can see all these Shasu people bound with their arms behind them, being led along and probably being brought back to Egypt to be used as slaves in the temples and building projects. Here's a blow up of a couple of them. You see they're dressed with kilts and with various kinds of headdress. So these are Shasu captives from a battle relief of Seti I. The men wore pointy beards and floppy caps. And this is an Egyptologist describing how some of them were dressed. Pointy beards and floppy caps, or caps with short tassels, while the warriors wore a short garment wrapped around their torso. Their weapons included spears and small duckbill axes. Here, Shasu warriors being beaten by Egyptian soldiers at a famous battle of Kadesh, where the pharaoh fought against the Hittites up in Syria. That's 1274 BC. The Baalua stela is from modern Jordan, and it shows what was probably like a Shasu sort of king in an Egyptian style. I'm going to go back again. This is sort of an Egyptian style of relief, showing a deity on the left giving a staff to the king in the middle. Now, the deity is indicated by these little horns coming off of his headdress, which is typical of a depiction of divine status. All right, so that's a line drawing of the same. And this comes from the same time period, the right around 1200 BC. Now, they also have evidence of ancient Edom being very active in mining of metal and copper in this south of the Dead Sea here in a place called the Wadi Fainan. So between 1200 and 500 BC, and they only found this area about 15 years ago, because before that, there was no evidence of Edom even being a nation state of any kind until much, much later, like 800 BC. That sounds very old, but in these terms, it's quite a bit later. But then they found this mining area, this vast mining area where this very high order of operation was going on for centuries, going all the way back to 1200 BC, which evidences a sort of state level of organization that probably was the first evidence of ancient Edom as a nation after they had settled in, not I mean tribal so much, but settling in as more of a nation state. So these would have been the Shasu of Edom. This is just more detail on that mining area, which we won't take the time to go through, but the site is called Kerben and Nahas. And it shows that this was an active area of ore mining for, let's see, 500 years, pretty much continuously. There's a scarab from a conquering pharaoh much later named Shishonk, which is mentioned in the Bible from the 10th century that was found in this area. So the Egyptians were interested in conquering these areas and controlling them if they could. The pottery styles are similar to ones found in the highland where we know Edom existed during a later period of time. So there's a cultural connection here to the Edomites. And this could have been the area where the Shasu were operating back during the time we were talking about. Now we have a fortress here that was excavated in recent years, which also shows Shasu here. You see this sort of typical headdress down here. This is a duckbill axe right here. So this is the shape of a duckbill and a common weapon of that time. And here you see depictions from those SETI, the first release we showed you a minute ago, of the same kind of headdress you see down here on the lower right, as in this guy over here. And then the sort of tassels coming off the back here, which is fairly similar. And here you have a duckbill axe, this guy's hand right here. All right, so I'm not going to go into this, but this goes into where the Israelite religion may have first formed. And there's a theory that it came amongst the Midianites. Remember, that was the in-laws of Moses. And then the Kenites, the tribe of the Kenites, play into this as well. So this is where some scholars started to think this is where Yahwism, as they call it, began. And lo and behold, we have a photograph of Moses right here with his father-in-law, don't you know, in full living color. Looks suspiciously like Charlton Heston. So the Midianite-Kenite hypothesis. We won't go into the details about that, but this is, it ties very much into the Bible to try to develop a theory about where Yahweh comes from. Now we come to our third document. This is the first mention of Israel outside of the Bible, period, in history. And it's called the Merneptah Stela. Remember I said that Ramses II was maybe the longest reigning pharaoh in history, over 60 years. And when he died, he probably had hundreds of kids and maybe 100 or 200 sons. And one of them happened to become pharaoh, who was in his 60s when he took over, and his name was Pharaoh Merneptah. And he didn't reign very long, only about 10 years. But he immediately went on campaign, because anytime you have a new king or, say, a new president taking over, the people who want to kind of attack you or test you, that's when they take their opportunity to see what you're made of. So they attack or they try to rebel and break away. This is a typical pattern going back to ancient times. So Merneptah was tested mainly by the Libyans to his west, where he was being threatened. And so this long stela, you can see, I'll go back to this, up here, the deity Amun addressing the king. So it's very familiar pattern where the divine or the king or the god is giving power and authority to the king or the pharaoh. And then you have a long inscription here which mentions his campaigning. This was found in 1896. I won't go into the details here in the interest of time. It still has some of its original colors, yellow, red, and blue. This is from 1208 or so BC. Amun is shown giving a sword to the king. And the main subject is Merneptah's year 5 campaign against the Libyans and another group of people called the Sea Peoples. So near the bottom, way down near, is it's okay. All the way down near the bottom in this little highlighted section is Israel mentioned almost as an afterthought. But this is a very important inscription for us as biblical interest and biblical interest. So here's Sir William Flinders Petrie, one of the great early archaeologists who did a lot of amazing things about systematizing the study of archaeology and the study of ceramics for dating and such. But this might have been his most important discovery ever. He had a scholar with him who could read the Egyptian and who first noticed that, hey, that may be Israel mentioned there. And Petrie's famous quote goes, "Won't the reverends be pleased?" And they were. So he says at dinner that evening, Petrie realized the importance of the find, said, "This stela will be better known in the world than anything else I have found." And he was right. That's his tombstone actually today in Jerusalem. So the Merneptah stela, it's like a poetic structure. It's called chiasm, and it's actually found in the Bible. It's an ancient form of sort of poetry, where you have repeating themes like the creation account and the flood account are given in chiasm. So you'll have a statement up here and then a statement under that, a statement under that, and then it comes out and almost parallels and reflects upon itself in the second half. So they're in parallel. They call it chiasm. So this particular passage is in chiasm, and there's old Pharaoh Merneptah himself, looking pretty good for 3,000 years old. So it says, Canaan is plundered with every evil. Ashkelon is conquered. Gezer is seized. Yanoam is made non-existent. Israel is laid waste. His seed is no more. So you would read that and think, well, I'd say Israel's pretty much finished. They've been destroyed, annihilated forever. They will never be heard from again. They're totally wiped out. But somehow that wasn't true. They lived on. We know that. So we have an example of really what is ancient propaganda here, where he's boasting about doing things that he didn't really do. Now, he may have met Israel in battle. We don't know. We actually don't have an account for this battle in the Bible. Of course, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. The Bible doesn't tell us every single thing that the Israelites did over 1,000 years, but we have the mention of Israel for the first time. And the Israel register is given right here. And what it indicates very importantly is, this is a hieroglyph for Tehenu, Libya. It features the throw stick, which is right here, which is a determinative. It means it's a way of categorizing the term that follows in Egyptian. So it indicates a land or a state. So at this point in time, Libya was a nation or a state, unlike Israel. So there's a throw stick, and there's the determinative for a land or a state. Kind of looks like a chunk of land. But the Israelites don't have that determinative. Their determinative indicates a landless, roaming type of people, which is exactly what we find in the book of Judges, where they're still not settled as a nation state. They're still living like in tribal arrangements, and likely still in tents in many cases, non-permanent kind of structures that we don't find in excavations. So this is a battle relief which shows Merneptah probably fighting against Israel. And you have the Israelites falling, by the wayside here on the ground. And then you have Pharaoh's supersized chariot and horse and everything trampling over them. Unfortunately, the upper half of that relief is missing. So all we have is the lower half. But it's been associated and connected to the actual inscription of the Merneptah stela. And this goes into an interpretation by a scholar named Yurko, who some years ago came up with this interpretation, which has prevailed. So we have evidence from the battle reliefs and from the inscription itself of ancient Israel. So that would be probably the first depiction of people that we can definitely identify as Israelites in history, and the first mention of Israel in history. Okay, I'm going to go by all these details about how he interpreted this and how he came up with this understanding. Here we have examples. Because these reliefs were on this grand temple of an earlier pharaoh, it was usurped by Merneptah, and so it took a lot of interpretation to come up with this idea that the inscriptions of the stela matched up with some of the battle reliefs on the temple walls. So what we have here too is a very important order of cities that were being conquered by Merneptah. Ashkelon is the first one you would encounter when you came into Canaan at that time across the Egyptian frontier, and it's along the coast. It later became a Philistine city, Ashkelon. And then comes Gezer, and Yanoam is located farther north. I'll show you a map in just a second. And then Israel comes in this order. So the battle reliefs name only Ashkelon on the battle reliefs, but they show 3 other fortified towns and an open field battle, which is what we think of the Israelites were fighting against Merneptah in, sort of an open field battle versus a city being besieged by the Egyptian army. So again, this is some of the detail I'm going to gloss over. Okay, so here's one of the depictions of the city of Ashkelon. And you can see on the upper left here, you have the walls and all the people up here that are praying for deliverance from the Egyptian army that is besieging them, even, praying, giving offerings and such so that he would be delivered. They would be delivered from the Egyptians. But of course, it didn't work in this case. And you see them climbing on the walls. And then you have Pharaoh and his chariot here, of course, supersized, laying siege to the city of Ashkelon. And you have similar depictions. Also, they called Ashkelon this vile town which his majesty overcame when it was wicked. So, of course, it's justified to destroy and conquer other people, right? Because they're wicked. So here's Gezer, possibly, which is another important city as you go farther north. And then Yanoam, also similarly being conquered. And then the supposed Israelites in open field battle against Merneptah. This shows Shasu prisoners in a relief being led away. Merneptah battle relief. This is just Merneptah from another stela. There's a nice colored version of it from inside or in a tomb. Now, this map shows the direction of what most scholars think the army of Merneptah came up the coast. Here's Gaza. Of course, today that's a Palestinian territory that's on the south border of Israel. And then you have Ashkelon just shortly up north. And then this was the main highway that went along sort of the sea. It's called the Via Maris by scholars, the way of the sea. So then comes Gezer, which is a very strategic city for going up into the Central Highlands from here or continuing north along the Via Maris. So this is the order of conquest, Ashkelon, Gezer. And then Yanoam is considered to be, this is still a little bit speculative, but it's over here in Jordan on the other side of the Jordan River Valley, Yanoam. And then comes Israel somewhere in open field battle, probably up in this central hill country, because this is where they eventually started to settle and became their core homeland. That is the north-south spine of the country called the central hill country. So somewhere in this area, likely they encountered Israel for the first time in battle. Megiddo is Megiddo what? The Battle of Armageddon is possibly will take place. There's a large plain here in front of the city, the plain of Megiddo. Yeah. And that was a very important city back then. In fact, it was conquered by an earlier pharaoh, Thutmose III, in which the king of Megiddo assembled all these other Canaanite kings and principalities, and they formed this confederation, and they were beaten by Thutmose III in a great battle. And then that began really the period where Egypt extended their domination and control all the way up into Canaan. It became like a province after that. Mm-hmm.
Because you guys know, God likes to bring everything full circle. That would be interesting if Armageddon happened there.
Mm-hmm.
And he defeated, we already know the end.
Right. We've lost the battle, but we've won the war, right? So these are different scholars' opinions about where Yanoam is located. There's several ancient sites that have been associated with that. Now, Yurko, the guy that came up with this theory about that the reliefs belong to the stela itself, believes that Merneptah went north to Yanoam, and then he came back again where Gezer and Ashkelon were threatened, and that's where he encountered Israel. But we really just don't know. I mean, short of some other discoveries, we probably never will know for sure. Okay, so let's see. The name presumed to reflect. This is Yurko's interpretation of the Merneptah stela, how it reflects Egyptian control of provinces and within the whole realm of Pharaoh. So we don't need to go into all that, but it mentions all these different place names like Libya and Hattai. Libya being on the western edge, a very powerful foe, and Hattai being the Hittites up into Syria, another very powerful foe. And between those then was an increasing level of control by the Pharaoh within those two. Okay, where was Israel located? We talked about that. Okay, the final thing we're talking about, this is actually just archaeological surveyed data. So we have these inscriptions, but now we have what almost all scholars agree is the first evidence of Israel as a people living in the land of Canaan. What was Canaan up until that time? And this comes by way of surveys. So you walk along the countryside and every ancient site and you pick up pottery. You take samples to find out what periods are represented in these various cities and settlements all across the land. And so you get a very big bird's eye view of settlement patterns and occupation over long periods of time. You find that you'll have periods of prosperity where there's lots of sites, big sites, and then it goes into decline where you won't have much pottery from this period at all, where it indicates maybe climatic conditions were bad or economic conditions, maybe conquest by a foe. So we have on this chart an indication of the number of sites within the area of Canaan that was surveyed. And this is the archaeological period. So this is like, for example, Middle Bronze Age, Late Bronze Age, Iron Age 2. So when we're talking about Joshua, we're talking about the Late Bronze Age. And then when you talk about Judges, you're getting into the Iron 1 period. And then Iron 2 is basically Samuel and Kings. So what it just shows here is a very big period of prosperity and power in Canaan during the Middle Bronze Age before Israel came in. And then Late Bronze Age going down. And then the Iron 1 period, look at the number of sites going from 47 to 219, and then all the way up to 605 by Iron 2. So what we're looking at here is Israel settling and emerging in the archaeological record, where the first they were during the Late Bronze Age, living like nomads, Bedouin, Shasu, call them what you will, and then settling in the Iron 1, and even more so during the period of the United Monarchy, followed by the Divided Monarchy, where they multiplied, the number of sites increased, etc. So this settlement map shows the number of sites increasing. And remember, this is the central hill country. This is Jordan River Valley going down the middle, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea. So on either side, and we know that they settled both on the Jordan side and on the Israel side with their tribal allotments, this was the core homeland of the Israelites. And you can see the number of settlements multiplying in subsequent periods of time. And this is generally regarded as the emergence of the Israelites settling down in their villages, in their towns. And these are the various tribal areas. And you can see by number of sites, them increasing from LB, Late Bronze to Iron 1. Look at the numbers, 32 in the tribal area of Manasseh, 32 to 147 to 220. So incredible growth. Now, we're talking about hundreds of years here. This isn't just a couple of decades, but you can see these large changes over periods of time from surveys. So the Iron 1 is the period where they first start to emerge as a settled people. We're talking about around 1200 BC. Now, the last inscription we're going to talk about is the Berlin statue pedestal relief. This was just rediscovered in the Berlin Museum about 10 or 12 years ago. And a scholar took a look at this. It used to be part of a base of a statue, probably, and it was hacked away by somebody who wanted to sell it, unfortunately. So we've lost the rest of it. But you'll see this familiar theme of captive individuals with name rings below them. And it so happens that one of these may contain the name of Israel. And this dates all the way back to the 15th, 14th century. That's the 1400s, 1300s BC. And some of it's kind of worn away, unfortunately, but one scholar has read this particular one. It's in the Berlin Museum, as I mentioned. It was discovered back in the turn of the last century, and then it was put away in storage and really kind of forgotten until it was sort of rediscovered the last 10 or 15 years. It's a gray, block of granite. It was probably hacked away for a fragment of a statue base. And unfortunately, most of the damage on this particular block is on the one that we're most concerned with on the right. The first two names are familiar, Ashkelon and Canaan. They're written consonantally, that is just the consonants, not the vowels. And it's comparable to earlier examples that we find from earlier pharaohs than the one named here. So it's thought that this is a copy of one of those lists again from an earlier period. This particular one that's been reconstructed because the right part of it has been kind of hacked away, shows that sort of bird up in the upper right hand there. It's tentatively dated the 19th dynasty, which is based upon the Merneptah Stela, similarities there. It reads Ashkelon, Canaan, and then whatever, There's a theophoric element that they believe is a shortened version of the name El or Il, as in meaning God. And he reconstructs Israel, but the difference is that instead of a sin, which is Israel, it's a shin, like an sh. So he proposes that this is an earlier um, version of Israel that was pronounced Ishrael, like an sh. It's an archaic version of Israel. And he dates this going back to Amenhotep II. So that's even earlier than that first one, the Soleb Temple, which was Amenhotep III. So this goes way back to around 1400 BC. So I titled this talk From the Shasu of Yahweh to the Sons of Israel. We talked about the Soleb Temple in Amun-Re, the Amara West Temple. Remember, it was probably a copy of the Soleb Temple. The Merneptah, the first mention of Israel in history, and the Berlin statue pedestal, which may contain an archaic version of Israel pronounced Ishrael. So with that, I conclude, and I want to advertise for First Miami's Archaeology Discipleship Group. This is what this lecture is a part of. We have a monthly series here, and the next one coming up will be Sunday, April the 11th. I know it sounds like the past, but we're looking from the past to the future, going back to April. So April 11th was the next talk we're going to have, and it's concerning the archaeology of the book of Judges, coming after Joshua, of course. And if you're interested, you can visit firstmiami.org/groups to learn more about First Miami's Archaeology Discipleship class series, and also about the other church groups that we have available online. So with that, we will call it the end as the sun sets over the temple at Soleb. Thank you very much.